The cold evening wind pushed through the skeletal frame of the prison camp as if the war itself were breathing through the cracks. Corporal Daniel Hayes had learned to recognize its sound, thin, bitter, and sharp, the kind of wind that scraped across the skin as though it wanted to remind every prisoner that freedom was only a memory. Beyond the wire fences, mountains hunched like silent judges, dark against the bruised sky. Inside the camp, voices were low, movements slower, and hope was a fragile, flickering ember kept close to the heart. Hayes walked with his head slightly bowed, the way most POWs did after months in captivity. But tonight his steps were more deliberate. He carried something hidden beneath the thin layer of his worn uniform, something he had hidden for months, something he tried to protect even when he could not protect himself. His fingers kept brushing against it, checking that it was still there. It was the only thing he had not surrendered. He stopped at the edge of the courtyard. A guard tower loomed nearby, and beneath it stood Sergeant Kenji Mori, the most feared guard in Shiramori Camp 6. Many guards were harsh, some were cruel. But Mori was different. His discipline was relentless, his temper volatile, and his eyes the coldest Hayes had ever seen. He was the one you avoided, prayed not to anger, and never made sudden moves around. But fate rarely listened to prayers. Mori turned just as Hayes passed within several yards of him. There was a moment, brief, sharp, when the guard's gaze landed on the suspicious shape beneath Hayes's jacket. Mori stiffened. "Hayes," he barked in clipped, Japanese-accented English. "Stop." Hayes froze. His pulse hammered. "Turn." Slowly. The other prisoners nearby slipped away like frightened shadows. Nobody wanted to witness what might happen next. No one wanted to be accidentally pulled into the storm. Hayes turned. Mori stepped forward, his boots striking the ground with measured force, each step louder in the quiet courtyard. His jaw clenched as his eyes narrowed on the bulge beneath Hayes's uniform. "What is that?" Hayes opened his mouth to speak, but no sound escaped. His throat felt packed with dust. Mori's hand shot out, gripping Hayes's collar and shoving him against the wooden wall of the nearest barrack. The impact knocked the breath from Hayes's lungs. Contraband, Mori hissed. "A weapon. A map. No, maybe a message to help prisoners escape." No." Hayes managed his voice a dry rasp. "It's not what you think." Mori didn't wait. His fist twisted the fabric tighter, practically lifting Hayes onto his toes. With his other hand he reached for the short wooden baton strapped at his belt. The wood was polished from too many uses. "You hide something," Mori growled. "You want to betray rules?" Hayes shook his head frantically. "Please, it's not please, just let me explain." But explanations held no weight here. War had burned too much humanity out of men like Mori. Suspicion grew like mold in the damp air. To him, a hidden object meant threat. Threat meant punishment. Mori pulled the baton free. Hayes felt his stomach plunge. The courtyard blurred around him. Cold sweat broke over his spine. He stumbled to speak anything that might stop the blow. "Sergeant, please." But Mori was already raising the baton, high eyes burning with fury, an anger that seemed older than the camp, older than Hayes, older than all of this. For a heartbeat, Hayes saw his own reflection in Mori's eyes, not the soldier he once was, but the exhausted, starved frame of a man hanging on by threads. And beneath that reflection he saw something else, grief. Mori swung. Hayes flinched, but in desperation his trembling hands moved without thought, opening the front of his jacket. The baton froze mid-air, because in Hayes's palms, shaking violently, fingers curled protectively around it, lay a small wooden omamori charm, worn smooth at the edges, its silk cord frayed from months of being hidden close to the skin. A Japanese good luck amulet, but this one bore a faint hand-carved initial on the back. Monsieur Mori's breath hitched. His eyes widened, not with anger now, but with something that looked dangerously close to pain. Where Mori's voice cracked something no one had ever heard. "Where did you get that?" Hayes swallowed hard. His hands shook worse as he held the charm out for Mori to take, but his voice, barely audible, carried the weight of months of guilt and memory. From a young soldier, on the ridge, the night your unit fell back. He was still alive when I found him." The world seemed to slow around them. Even the wind hushed. Mori stared at the charm as though he were seeing a ghost. His knuckles whitened around the baton, but he did not strike. Hayes's mind reeled back unbidden to that night months ago, a moonlit slope, bodies scattered across the earth, soft groans and fading breaths. Hayes had been separated from his squad, crawling through brush trying to find shelter. And then he had found a boy. Japanese, barely 18, clutching his side, whispering something through blood and air. Something Hayes never forgot. He held this in his hand. Hayes said, voice trembling. He tried to give it to me. He said to return it home. To his brother. The baton slipped from Maury's loosened grip and thudded onto the dirt. The guard's face twisted not with rage, but with a grief so raw, Hayes instinctively looked away. My brother, Maury whispered in Japanese, the words breaking. My brother. Hayes forced himself to continue. I didn't know who he meant. But when they captured me, I kept it. I thought somehow maybe I'd find the right person. Maury stared at the omamori as though it were a beating heart. The courtyard was silent. Prisoners watched from the shadows. Guards paused mid-step. Even the tower light flickered weakly as if afraid to intrude. Slowly, stiffly, Maury reached out. Hayes placed the charm in his hand. Maury's fingers closed around it, trembling more than Hayes's had been. He opened the carved backside and saw the worn initial confirming what he already knew in his bones. The young soldier in Hayes's memory. The dying boy on that cold ridge, the one murmuring words Hayes did not understand, was Kenji Mori's younger brother. The air between them changed. The fury that had fueled Mori dissolved into shock, grief, confusion. For the first time, Hayes saw not the cruel guard, but a man shattered by a revelation he never expected, held together only by duty and the ghost of someone he lost. Why? Mori's voice was barely a whisper. Why would you keep this? Why not throw it away? Why protect it? Hayes blinked back, a burn behind his eyes. Because I owed him that much, he said softly. He didn't die alone, and no one should lose something so important. Mori shut his eyes. The baton lay forgotten. The wind carried the faintest sound, maybe leaves, maybe memory. When Mori opened his eyes again, they were no longer the cold, merciless eyes of a prison guard. They were the eyes of a brother who had just received the last piece of someone he loved. And for the first time since Hayes arrived at the camp, Mori stepped back. He let Hayes go. Sergeant Kenji Mori did not speak for a long time. The omamori lay in his palm like a burning coal, small yet unbearably heavy. The silk cord, frayed and darkened, felt fragile against his calloused fingers, as if one wrong movement might make it crumble into dust. He closed his hand around it, pressing it so hard into his skin that the edges dug in. But the pain didn't anchor him. If anything, it made the world around him tilt even more. Corporal Daniel Hayes, still pressed against the wooden barrack wall moments earlier, remained rooted in place. He dared not move. He wasn't sure he could, even if he tried. His limbs trembled with the fading shock of nearly being beaten unconscious, but the tremor now came from something deeper, something rawer. Mori finally stepped back, but only a single pace. His breath shook. His jaw worked as if trying to find words that refused to come. When he finally whispered, his voice was unlike anything Hayes had ever heard from him, thin, cracked, stripped of the rigid authority he always carried. "Describe him," Mori said. The soldier you saw. Tell me everything." Hayes swallowed, then nodded. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. It was late, Hayes began, voice quiet. I'd gotten separated from my squad during the retreat. I was trying to find shelter, someplace to dig in for the night. That's when I heard someone calling for water. He paused, memory tightening around his ribs. I crawled toward the sound. He was lying between two rocks like he'd dragged himself there. His uniform was torn. He was bleeding badly, but he was awake barely. Maury's face tightened, pain flickering behind his eyes like a trapped flame. He looked young. Hayes continued. Too young. Maury closed his eyes. He was 17. Hayes exhaled, long and shaken. God. He continued, speaking softly as though afraid his voice might bruise the memory. When I reached him, he grabbed my sleeve. His fingers were cold. He spoke Japanese. I didn't understand the words, but I recognized the tone. Maury opened his eyes, gaze sharp and searching. What tone? Hayes looked down, remembering those fading breaths on a moonlit ridge. A tone of apology, and fear, and something like hope. A faint tremor rippled through Maury's arm. He lowered his head just enough that the shadow from the guard tower cut across his eyes. Did he say a name? Maury whispered. Anything that sounded like Kenji. Hayes's brows furrowed. He said something, over and over. I couldn't understand it then, but it sounded like Ani or Aniki. Maury's breath caught in his throat. That means older brother, he whispered. Hayes felt the weight of that settle like cold ash across his shoulders. I'm sorry, Hayes murmured. I wish I could have understood more. Maury shook his head sharply, not in anger, but in an attempt to steady himself. Did he suffer? Hayes hesitated. Then, with honesty that carried its own kind of mercy, he said, No. Not long. He was slipping away when I found him. He used his last strength just to hand me the charm. Maury swallowed hard, throat bobbing. For a moment he looked as if he might collapse. Instead he stepped away, turning his back on Hayes. The silence hung heavy. The wind carried the faint clang of distant gates, the murmurs of prisoners. But for a stretch of time all Hayes could hear was Maury's uneven breathing. Then suddenly, "You lie." The words snapped through the air like a whip. Hayes flinched. Maury whirled around, eyes now burning with something jagged, half grief, half fury, all unbearable. His voice rose thick with raw emotion. "You lie," he repeated, stepping forward. "This story, you create it to save yourself, to avoid punishment, to trick me." Hayes shook his head. "No, I swear my brother would not give this to you," Maury shouted, holding the omamori up like evidence. He would not trust his final words to an American enemy. Hayes felt a sudden sting in his chest, but he stood firm. "He didn't care who I was," Hayes said softly. "He saw a person, not a uniform. Liar." Maury lunged forward and grabbed Hayes again, not by the collar this time, but by the front of his shirt, pulling him so close Hayes could feel Maury's breath trembling with rage. "If you dishonor him with falsehoods," Maury hissed, "I will." "I'm not lying," Hayes choked out, voice cracking. "I'm telling you what happened. I kept that charm for months, through marches, beatings, starvation, because he asked me to return it." Maury's eyes hardened. "You think I believe this? That a dying soldier would hand his most sacred charm to the enemy, responsible for his death?" Hayes shook his head fiercely. "I wasn't the one who shot him." Maury froze. The grip on Hayes's shirt loosened. "What did you say?" Hayes took a shaky breath. "I wasn't the one who wounded him. I found him. After the fighting moved. There were bullet casings everywhere, but none from my rifle." Maury stared, stunned. His hand dropped away entirely. Hayes continued cautiously. He grabbed my wrist, pressed the charm into my hand. He said something, like, "home." He kept trying to say, "return." Maury's mask cracked further. The rigid posture he always held slipped, replaced by the trembling form of a brother trying to reconcile two impossible truths. Still, he clenched his jaw. "You expect me to believe this?" he whispered. Hayes reached slowly into his pocket, deliberately palms open, so Maury knew he wasn't hiding anything dangerous, and pulled out something folded thin and crinkled with age. A scrap of paper. "I kept this too," Hayes said. "It was tucked behind the wooden panel inside the charm." Maury's breath caught. Hayes unfolded it. The paper was stained with water and soil, but a few lines of Japanese writing remained intact. "I couldn't read it," Hayes said, "but I kept it safe." He handed it to Maury with two hands, a gesture Hayes had seen prisoners use to show respect. Maury hesitated, then took it, gripping the paper as though it might vanish if he blinked. He read, then reread, then his face broke. The writing was unmistakably his brother's clumsy strokes, uneven ink pressure, the way he always pressed too hard on the first character. Maury knew those imperfections better than his own heartbeat. It was a prayer, a wish, a hope for the future. And at the bottom, a single line. "If someone finds this charm, please bring it to my brother Kenji. The war will end someday, but what remains should be peace." Maury staggered back as if struck. His hand clamped over his mouth. His shoulders shook. Hayes watched, unsure whether to speak or remain silent. He had seen men break on battlefields, but nothing like this, nothing as tragic or intimate. He witnessed the moment the villain of the camp became something painfully human. Maury crumpled slightly, gripping the charm to his chest. He squeezed his eyes shut and whispered something in Japanese, maybe a thank you, maybe an apology, maybe the brother's name. Then suddenly the grief pivoted into anger, once more directed not at Hayes but at the universe itself. Why, Maury rasped. Why would he trust you? Why would fate? His voice broke. Give you his final message instead of me. Hayes's voice gentled. Maybe because I was the one there. Maybe because he didn't want to die alone. Maury trembled, his entire frame shaking like a man standing in a storm he could no longer control. Hayes took a slow breath. Sergeant, I didn't come here to hurt you. I kept that charm to honor your brother. That's all. Maury stared at him for the first time, not with hatred, but with profound, unwilling belief. The camp bell rang in the distance, faint and metallic. Maury blinked himself back into the present. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. I need time. Then he turned sharply and walked away, almost stumbling into the dark rain beginning to fall. He clutched the charm the way a drowning man clutches a lifeline. And Hayes remained alone in the courtyard, breath trembling, heart pounding, knowing the fragile line between life and death had just shifted in a direction he could not yet understand. Night settled over Shiramori Camp 6, like a heavy curtain dimming the world into quiet shapes and muted shadows. The rain that had begun earlier now softened into a fine mist, hushing the camp into something close to stillness. Hayes sat on the corner of his bunk, back against the cold wooden post, hands clasped to stop their trembling, not from fear now, but from the weight of what had just happened. Across the barracks, a few prisoners whispered about the incident, not loudly. Hayes had become something of a ghost in their eyes, half doomed, half miraculous. No one had seen Maury freeze like that before. No one had seen him walk away from punishment he had been ready to deliver. But Hayes couldn't feel triumph, only exhaustion, and something deeper, something that felt like the beginning of a bruise around his heart. Hours passed. His eyelids drooped. He leaned back, letting the patter of rain on the tin roof lull him. For a while he drifted in that strange twilight between sleep and memory. And there, unbidden, the image of the young soldier returned, the dying boy on the ridge, whispering words Hayes had never understood until tonight. Aniki. Home. Return. Hayes exhaled shakily. I kept my promise, he murmured, but somehow it didn't feel finished. Something still hung in the air between him and Maury like a half-built bridge. Outside, gravel crunched under steady footsteps. Hayes's eyes snapped open. The barrack door slid open with a low creak, letting in a sharp gust of cold air, and Sergeant Maury stepped inside. Every prisoner fell instantly silent. Maury walked with purpose, but not with the stiff military sharpness he always carried. His shoulders looked heavier. His eyes, different. He scanned the room until his gaze locked on Hayes. Come, Maury said quietly. Hayes hesitated. Part of him wondered if this was a trap, some delayed punishment now that Maury had regained control. But something in the guard's posture said otherwise. Hayes stood slowly. The prisoners watched with breath held as he followed Maury out into the night. The air carried the bitterness of damp earth and faint smoke. Lanterns glowed faintly along the fence line like distant stars. Maury led Hayes to a storage shed behind the barracks, far enough that no one would overhear, but close enough that Hayes didn't fear disappearance. Once under the shed's overhang, Maury stopped. He didn't look at Hayes at first. Instead, he stared at the ground, the charm dangling from his fingers, the silk cord brushing lightly against his knuckles. For a long moment, neither spoke. Rain dripped from the edge of the roof, steady and soft. Finally, Maury exhaled a faint, trembling sound. I read the paper again, he said. Hayes nodded, unsure how to respond. He wrote it months ago. Maury continued. Before that battle. Before everything. His voice tightened. He carried this charm everywhere. Our mother gave it to him when he left home. She said it would protect him. Hayes listened, his breath, slow, careful. Maury closed his fingers around the omamori. When we received news, he was missing. My mother prayed every night he might be alive somewhere. But I knew better. His jaw clenched. I have seen enough battlefields to know what missing means. Hayes swallowed. "I'm sorry." Maury looked up sharply, eyes flashing not with anger but confusion at hearing sympathy where he expected silence. "You said that before," Maury murmured. "You apologize, as if you were the one who killed him." Hayes lowered his eyes. "Sometimes surviving feels like its own kind of guilt." The words hung between them, gentle wounded, and something in Maury cracked at the edges. He leaned back against the shed wall, letting out a slow exhale. "Tell me," he said after a long pause, "why did you return it? Why not keep it for yourself, or hide it better, or throw it away when you realized guards would beat you if they found it?" Hayes hesitated. The truth felt vulnerable, almost shameful. "Because—" Hayes took a breath. "He asked me to, and because I owed him something I couldn't repay." "What do you mean?" Hayes's voice softened. He could have cried for help, or cursed me, or begged me to leave, but instead, he reached out to a stranger, an enemy. He used his dying breath to hold on to compassion. Hayes looked at Maury carefully. "I wanted to honor that, even if it cost me." Maury stared at him for several seconds, long, silent, assessing. Rain pattered against the dirt behind them. Somewhere a guard barked an order, distant and muffled. Then Maury looked away again. "My brother was gentle," he said quietly. "Too gentle for war." He stroked the charm with his thumb. "He raised birds when we were children, said he liked things that could fly freely." Hayes smiled faintly. "He talked about that. Not in words I understood, but in the way he looked toward the sky." Maury's breath caught. Emotion flickered across his face like a shadow passing over a candle. For the first time, their grief touched the same space. Hayes sank down onto a wooden crate, feeling his legs tremble. Maury didn't stop him, didn't bark at him to stand. Instead, Maury himself stepped closer and sat on the ground beside the crate, resting his back against the wall. It was an unimaginable sight. A guard and a prisoner sitting side by side under the same thin strip of dry shelter, two silhouettes softened by rain, two men holding the same loss. Maury spoke again, his voice lower. "When you held out the charm, at first I wanted to strike you regardless. My rage was blind." His hands tightened, "but then I saw the way your fingers shook. Not with fear, with reverence." Hayes's chest tightened. "He meant something to me, even if it was brief." Maury glanced at him. "Why does a man remember another man he knew for only a minute?" Hayes met his gaze. "Because death has a way of settling into the places we least expect, and kindness, even a small kindness, stays longer than anything else." A silence followed, soft but profound. It was Maury who broke it. "Hayes?" He said the name no longer sharp or hostile. "We are on opposite sides, bound by orders neither of us chose. But for this moment," he looked at the charm, "we share something the war cannot take." Hayes nodded slowly. "Your brother." "Our grief," Maury corrected gently. Hayes swallowed hard. He felt something shift, an easing, a loosening inside his chest. A bridge, fragile and improbable, forming plank by plank. Maury stared down at his hands. His next words came hesitantly, as though he were stepping onto that bridge for the first time. "Perhaps we are both prisoners," he said. "You behind these fences?" He paused. "And I behind my duty. And my anger." Hayes looked at him, stunned by the honesty. The rain slowed to a whisper. Maury placed the charm gently on the crate between them, equidistant like a shared offering. "Tonight," Maury said softly, "we put down our weapons." Hayes nodded. "Tonight. We just remember him." Both men bowed their heads, not in shared culture or ritual, but in shared humanity. Maury closed his eyes. "Arigato," he whispered, "for not letting him die forgotten." Hayes felt his throat tighten. "Thank you, for letting me return him home even in this small way." They sat like that for a long time, two men in the quiet listening to the rain, the camp, the echoes of a boy who once raised birds and believed the war would end someday. It was the first night since his capture that Hayes felt he could breathe, and the first night Maury allowed himself to grieve. Dawn crept into Shiramori Camp 6 with a muted, washed-out light, the kind that made everything look pale and exhausted. For days, sickness had swept through the prison barracks like a silent enemy fever. Dehydration men collapsing during roll call. Hayes was one of the worst hit. He lay on his bunk, drenched in sweat, chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. The guards tried to contain the outbreak with strict measures, but conditions were already dire. Men whispered that anyone who fell too ill simply never woke up. Through the blur of fever, Hayes occasionally sensed someone near him, cool water pressed to his lips, a damp cloth against his forehead, a voice speaking quietly in Japanese. At first he thought it was a dream, but one night, when the moon cast a thin silver beam through the barracks' broken slats, he saw clearly Sergeant Maury kneeling beside him. Maury pressed a small canteen to Hayes's lips. "Drink," he murmured, voice low but urgent. Slowly, Hayes forced the water down, throat-burning. "You shouldn't be here," he croaked. Maury shook his head. "Rules matter less than men's lives." Hayes almost smiled, but exhaustion pulled him back under. Maury stayed until dawn, leaving only when another guard approached. In the following days, when Hayes drifted between consciousness and fever dreams, Maury returned again and again, bringing small scraps of rice, a dry blanket, or simply sitting nearby when the camp grew too quiet. It was the strangest form of protection. Discreet, dangerous, entirely human. By the time the fever broke, word spread through the camp like wildfire. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. Repatriation would begin. Freedom, real, unimaginable freedom, approached like a rising tide. On the morning the prisoners were to be escorted out, the sky stretched clear for the first time in weeks. Hayes dressed in his tattered uniform, each movement stiff but purposeful. The other prisoners shuffled toward the camp gate. Guards lined up to oversee the transfer. Some guards looked relieved, others looked ashamed. All seemed changed by the news. Hayes searched the line for Maury. He wasn't there. A pang of something like disappointment flickered across his chest. When his name was called, Hayes stepped forward, clutching the rail of the support truck waiting outside the gate. The world beyond it felt impossibly vast. He took a breath, preparing to climb aboard. Hayes. The voice came softly behind him. Hayes turned. Maury stood several paces away, out of formation, head lowered slightly, like a man trying to approach without causing alarm. His uniform was immaculate, but his expression was starkly open, unshielded, in a way Hayes had never seen. Hayes stepped toward him. "I thought," Hayes swallowed, "I thought you wouldn't come." Maury shook his head. "There is something I must give you." From inside his jacket, Maury withdrew a small folded paper, thin, yellowed, creased from being handled many times. Hayes recognized the handwriting immediately. It was the same script from the scrap hidden in the charm. "My brother carried 2 letters," Maury said quietly. "One for me, one for whoever found him." He hesitated. "For you." Hayes's breath caught. "For me," Maury nodded and placed the paper in Hayes's hand with both palms, a gesture of respect so profound Hayes felt the weight of it in his bones. Hayes unfolded it. The letter was short, written in uneven strokes. "To the soldier who finds me, war has brought us here as enemies. But I do not wish to leave the world with hatred. If you survive, please live in a way I no longer can. Protect someone, forgive someone, hold something gentle in your heart. If you can, please tell my brother I was not afraid at the end." Maury Wren Hayes blinked hard, vision blurring. He looked up. Maury stood still, eyes glistening, though he did not shed a tear. "He wasn't afraid," Hayes said softly, voice breaking. "He held my hand. He looked toward the sky. He died with peace." Maury closed his eyes, letting that truth settle inside him. When he opened them again, his voice was steady. "I am in your debt, Hayes, for keeping his last words, for honoring him, for surviving when you might have given up." Hayes shook his head. "We're just 2 men who lived through something we shouldn't have had to." Maury's lips tightened, agreement, pain, acceptance, all woven into one quiet expression. Behind them, an officer called out, "Last boarding move." Hayes turned, knowing their time was nearly over. Then he looked back at Maury. "You could have hated me," Hayes said. "Most men would have." Maury straightened. "Hatred keeps the war alive. My brother asked for peace. I will honor him." Hayes nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "What will you do now?" Maury exhaled, gaze drifting toward the horizon beyond the mountains. "Go home. Tell my mother. Try to live differently." Hayes smiled faintly. "Then maybe both of us get to start over." A long silence stretched between them, one that said everything words couldn't. Then slowly Maury stepped back and raised his hand to his forehead in a formal military bow of respect. Hayes stiffened, then returned the salute with the crisp, weary gesture of an American soldier who finally understood what reconciliation looked like. For a moment, two men who should have remained enemies stood facing each other as equals, as human beings, as survivors. Hayes turned toward the truck. Before boarding, he looked back one last time. Maury stood alone beside the gate, the morning sun catching the small omamori hanging from his belt. He bowed deep, full, sincere. Hayes placed a hand over his heart in silent acknowledgement. Then he stepped through the gate, stepping into freedom, carrying with him not just a letter but a promise that peace was possible even between men who met in the ruins of war.